In 1991, Ukraine became the world's third largest nuclear power overnight. By 1996, they had given up every single warhead. But what if they hadn't? What if Ukraine had kept its nuclear arsenal? Today, we're diving into one of the most consequential what ifs in modern history. Like when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine inherited approximately 1,900 nuclear warheads and 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles. To put that in perspective, that was more nuclear firepower than Britain, France, and China combined. Yet within 5 years, Ukraine had transferred every weapon to Russia in exchange for security guarantees. But in our alternate timeline, Ukraine makes a different choice.
Chapter 1, the decision to keep the bombs, the point of divergence. In our timeline, Ukraine's leadership under President Leonid Kravchuk faced immense pressure from the United States, Russia, and the international community to give up their nuclear weapons. The newly independent nation was economically devastated, and the promise of Western aid and security guarantees seemed like the practical choice. But what if Ukraine's parliament had voted differently? What if they had looked at their position surrounded by Russia with a history of foreign domination and decided that nuclear weapons were their only guarantee of true independence? Immediate challenges. This decision wouldn't have been easy. Ukraine would have faced several immediate problems. First, they didn't control the command and control systems. Moscow still held the launch codes. Ukrainian engineers would have needed to reverse engineer and modify these systems, a complex but not impossible task. Second, maintaining nuclear weapons is incredibly expensive. Ukraine's economy was in free fall, and nuclear weapons require constant maintenance, security, and technological upgrades. Third, international isolation would have been severe. The United States and Western Europe were committed to nuclear non-proliferation and would have imposed harsh sanctions. Chapter 2, the nuclear Ukraine emerges, building the nuclear state. Let's assume Ukraine overcame these initial hurdles. By 1995, they've successfully established control over their nuclear arsenal and declared themselves a nuclear state. This sends shockwaves through the international system. Russia's reaction would have been severe. Moscow viewed Ukrainian nuclear weapons as an existential threat. Nuclear weapons in the hands of a country they considered within their sphere of influence. Economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and possibly even military threats would have followed. The United States would have found itself in a complex position. On one hand, they opposed nuclear proliferation. On the other hand, a nuclear Ukraine could serve as a counterbalance to Russian power in Eastern Europe. Regional dynamics, Poland, Hungary, and other Eastern European nations would have been deeply concerned about nuclear weapons so close to their borders. This might have accelerated NATO expansion as these countries sought security guarantees against both Russian and Ukrainian nuclear capabilities. Meanwhile, other former Soviet states might have reconsidered their own nuclear status. Kazakhstan, which also inherited nuclear weapons, might have decided to keep theirs as well. Chapter 3, the Putin era and nuclear deterrence. Putin's rise. When Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, he inherited a very different strategic situation. In our timeline, Putin could pressure Ukraine because they had no ultimate deterrent, but nuclear Ukraine would have been untouchable through conventional military means. The 2004 Orange Revolution might have unfolded differently. Would Putin have dared to interfere in Ukrainian elections knowing that Ukraine possessed nuclear weapons? The psychological impact of nuclear deterrence extends far beyond military calculations. It affects every aspect of international relations. Nuclear doctrine. Ukraine would have needed to develop a nuclear doctrine. Unlike the superpowers with their massive arsenals, Ukraine would have operated under a doctrine of existential deterrence, nuclear weapons as the ultimate guarantee against conquest or regime change. This doctrine would have been particularly relevant given Ukraine's history of foreign domination and the size difference between Ukraine and Russia. Chapter 4, The crisis that never happened. The moment of truth. The biggest test of our alternate timeline comes in 2014. In our world, Russia annexed Crimea and supported separatists in eastern Ukraine. But would Putin have risked nuclear escalation? The answer is almost certainly no. Nuclear weapons create what strategists call stability-instability paradox. They prevent major wars, but might make smaller conflicts more likely. However, the annexation of territory from a nuclear power crosses a red line that even Putin would have been unlikely to cross. Instead, Russia might have pursued different strategies: cyber warfare, economic pressure, or supporting internal political opposition, but direct territorial aggression would have been off the table. Alternative pressures. This doesn't mean Ukraine would have been free from Russian pressure. Moscow might have focused on energy dependence, economic warfare, and information operations. The struggle would have been just as intense, but fought with different tools. Chapter 5, the broader implications, nuclear proliferation. A nuclear Ukraine would have fundamentally altered the global nuclear order. If Ukraine could successfully maintain nuclear weapons despite international pressure, other countries might have concluded that nuclear weapons were the ultimate security guarantee. Iran might have accelerated its nuclear program, arguing that if Ukraine could have nuclear weapons, why not Iran? The nuclear non-proliferation treaty might have unraveled as more countries sought nuclear capability. Alliance structures, NATO's eastern expansion might have been even faster and more extensive. Nuclear weapons in Ukraine would have created a complex security environment where traditional alliance structures might have been insufficient. Alternatively, some argue that a nuclear Ukraine might have made NATO expansion unnecessary from Ukraine's perspective, potentially reducing tensions between NATO and Russia. Economic development. The economic cost of maintaining nuclear weapons would have been enormous for Ukraine. Money spent on nuclear weapons is money not spent on economic development, infrastructure, or social programs. Ukraine might have remained economically stagnant, trapped by the costs of nuclear deterrence. Chapter 6, the world today. Current implications. In our alternate 2024, we might be living in a very different world. Ukraine would be a recognized nuclear power, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Eastern Europe. The current conflict that began in 2022 would never have happened. Not because tensions wouldn't exist, but because nuclear deterrence would have prevented direct military confrontation. However, this might have come at the cost of a more unstable global nuclear order. More countries might have nuclear weapons, creating additional risks of nuclear terrorism, accidents, or regional nuclear conflicts. The security dilemma. Ukraine's decision to keep nuclear weapons would have created a classic security dilemma. Actions taken to increase Ukraine's security would have decreased security for others, potentially leading to an arms race in Eastern Europe. Russia might have modernized its nuclear forces even faster, while NATO might have deployed more nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe as a counterbalance. The trade-off. The question of whether Ukraine should have kept its nuclear weapons involves a fundamental trade-off. In our timeline, Ukraine gave up ultimate security for the promise of international integration and economic development. In our alternate timeline, Ukraine chose ultimate security at the cost of international isolation and economic burden. In essence, for today, this thought experiment reveals the complex calculations that countries face in our nuclear age. Nuclear weapons provide ultimate security, but at enormous cost: economic, diplomatic, and moral. The Ukrainian case also demonstrates why nuclear proliferation remains one of the most critical challenges of our time. Every new nuclear power changes the global strategic equation in unpredictable ways. Final thought. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is that there are no perfect choices in international relations. Ukraine's leaders in the 1990s faced an impossible decision, and the consequences of that choice continue to reverberate today. In our alternate timeline, they would have faced different consequences, but consequences nonetheless. What do you think? Should Ukraine have kept its nuclear weapons? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more explorations of history's biggest what-ifs.